The night my 10-year-old great-grandson showed up on my front porch in the pouring rain with nothing but a backpack and red, watery eyes, I knew someone in my family had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. My name is Evelyn Parker, and at 78 years old I thought I had already seen the worst kinds of family heartbreak. I had buried my husband 12 years earlier. I had watched relatives argue over inheritances, houses, and old grudges. I had seen marriages fall apart and friendships disappear. But nothing prepared me for the sight of little Mason standing under my porch light on a cold October evening, shivering as rainwater dripped from the sleeves of his blue jacket. The wind rattled the maple trees in my front yard as I hurried to open the door. Mason looked so small standing there. His blonde hair was plastered to his forehead. His sneakers were soaked through. His backpack hung from one shoulder as though it weighed 50 pounds. "Mason," I said, pulling him inside. "Honey, what happened?" He stepped into the warmth of my house and lowered his head. For a moment he didn't answer. He just stood there staring at the hardwood floor while water pooled around his shoes. Then he whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. "Grandma Rachel told me to leave." My heart stopped. Rachel was my daughter-in-law. She had been married to my son Daniel for nearly 15 years. I stared at Mason, waiting for him to explain. Surely there had been some misunderstanding. Maybe he was upset after an argument. Maybe he had misheard something. But when he finally looked up at me, I saw genuine confusion in his eyes. The kind of confusion only a child can have when the adults around him stop making sense. I helped him out of his wet jacket and led him into the kitchen. The familiar scent of chicken soup still lingered in the air from dinner. I wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and set a mug of hot chocolate in front of him. He wrapped both hands around the cup as though he was trying to hold on to something solid. "Tell me exactly what happened," I said gently. Mason swallowed hard. "She said I wasn't welcome there anymore." The words settled over the kitchen like a heavy fog. "Why would she say that?" I asked. He shook his head. "I don't know." His voice cracked. "I really don't know." I looked at the old grandfather clock near the dining room entrance. It was nearly 8:30. Daniel should have been home from work hours ago. None of this made sense. Rachel had always been difficult, controlling, cold sometimes. But throwing a 10-year-old child out of the house? No. Even for her that seemed impossible. Yet Mason was sitting right in front of me. Vet. Frightened. Alone. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You're safe here," I said. "Nobody is sending you anywhere tonight." He nodded, but the fear remained in his eyes. As he sipped his hot chocolate, I walked into the hallway and stared at the framed family photographs hanging on the wall. Smiling faces, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, summer barbecues. Looking at them now, something felt wrong. As though there was a secret hidden behind every picture. A secret I had somehow missed for years. Then I made a decision. I didn't call my son. I didn't call Rachel. Instead, I picked up my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and called Michael Reed, the Parker family attorney. Because deep down, I had a feeling this wasn't about a child being sent away for one night. I had a feeling someone was trying to remove Mason from something much bigger. Michael Reed answered on the second ring. That alone told me something was unusual. Michael had been the Parker family attorney for more than 20 years. He was careful, professional, and never the type to pick up late evening calls unless he believed they mattered. "Evelyn," he said, his voice calm but alert. "Is everything all right?" I looked through the kitchen doorway at Mason. He was sitting quietly at the table, staring into his mug as though searching for answers inside the swirling chocolate. "No," I said. "I do not think it is." I explained what had happened. Every detail. The rain. The backpack. Rachel telling Mason he was no longer welcome. When I finished, there was a long silence. "Michael?" I asked. "I am here," he replied. "Has Rachel contacted you recently?" The question caught me off guard. "No." "Why?" Another pause. "I think we should meet tomorrow morning." My stomach tightened. "What is going on?" "Not over the phone," he said. 9 o'clock. My office. Before hanging up, he added something that stayed with me all night. "Keep Mason with you." After the call ended, I returned to the kitchen. Mason had finished half his drink. Some color had returned to his face. He looked exhausted. 10-year-old children should worry about homework, baseball practice, and which cereal to eat for breakfast. They should not be carrying the weight I saw behind his eyes. "Can I stay here tonight?" he asked quietly. "As long as you need," I said. Relief flashed across his face. I helped him settle into the guest room upstairs, the same room my grandchildren had used during summer visits for years. Fresh sheets, a reading lamp, family photographs on the dresser. Nothing fancy, just a safe place. Before turning off the light, I sat on the edge of the bed. "Mason," I said softly, "did Rachel tell you why she wanted you gone?" He hesitated. Then he nodded. "Sort of." My heart sank. "What did she say?" He looked down at the blanket. "She said I did not belong there anymore." Those words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were cruel, because they sounded rehearsed, deliberate, like something that had been decided long before that evening. After he fell asleep, I walked through my quiet house. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. I stopped in front of an old photograph hanging near the staircase. It showed my late husband, Walter, standing beside Daniel when he was about Mason's age. Both smiling, both proud. Walter had always believed family was a responsibility, not a convenience. Looking at that picture, I suddenly remembered something he told me shortly before he passed away. "Some gifts are not meant for today," he had said. "They are meant to protect tomorrow." At the time, I thought he was talking about life in general. Standing there in the darkness, I began to wonder if he had meant something far more specific. And for the first time, I found myself asking a question I had never considered before. What exactly had Rachel discovered that made a 10-year-old boy seem like a threat? The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Sleep had come in short, restless stretches, and every time I opened my eyes, I found myself thinking about the same thing. Mason was only 10 years old. Children do not get pushed aside for no reason. By 7 o'clock, the smell of coffee filled my kitchen. Mason came downstairs wearing one of the spare sweatshirts I kept for visiting grandchildren. For the first time since arriving, he looked slightly more relaxed. He sat at the table and quietly ate a bowl of cereal while morning light filtered through the windows. I watched him carefully. Children often reveal the truth without realizing it. "Did anything happen at school?" I asked. He shook his head. "No." "Did you and Rachel have an argument?" Again he shook his head. "Not really." The answer lingered between us. "Not really." It was the kind of response that meant more than it said. Before I could ask another question, my phone buzzed. "Daniel." I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Mom," he said immediately. "Is Mason with you?" His voice sounded strained. "Tired?" "Yes," I replied. "He is safe." Relief escaped him in a long breath. "Thank goodness." I waited. "Daniel," I said carefully, "do you know why your son was sent away from his own home?" Silence. Then, "Rachel told me there was a misunderstanding." I closed my eyes. A misunderstanding. The phrase felt rehearsed. Convenient. "Your son spent last night standing in the rain with a backpack," I said quietly. "That is not a misunderstanding." Daniel did not answer right away. "I am heading into a meeting," he finally said. "Can we talk tonight?" "Of course," I replied. But after hanging up, I felt more uneasy than before. Daniel sounded confused. Not defensive. Not angry. Confused. That told me he either did not know the whole story, or someone had made sure he never saw it. At 9 o'clock sharp, I arrived at Michael Reed's office downtown. The building was familiar. Walter and I had sat in those same conference rooms many times over the years, discussing family trusts, estate planning, and charitable donations. Michael greeted me personally and led me into a private room. A thick folder rested on the polished oak table. My stomach tightened the moment I saw it. "Evelyn," he said, taking a seat across from me, "what I am about to show you may explain more than you realize." He opened the folder. Inside were copies of legal correspondence, financial documents, and several letters. I recognized Rachel's name almost immediately. "Why is she involved in all this?" I asked. Michael folded his hands together. Because for the past 6 months she has been asking questions about certain family assets. I frowned. What assets? He looked directly at me. Assets connected to Mason. The room suddenly felt smaller. I do not understand. Michael slid a document toward me. At the top was Walter's signature. My late husband's unmistakable handwriting filled the page. Seeing it after all these years made my chest tighten. Walter established a protected trust long ago, Michael said. Most family members never knew it existed. I stared at the paper. Who is the beneficiary? Michael's expression remained steady. Mason Parker. For several seconds I could not speak. The ticking of the wall clock seemed unnaturally loud. Then another realization hit me. Rachel had started asking questions 6 months ago. Mason had been removed from the house yesterday. And suddenly those events no longer felt unrelated. For a long moment I simply stared at Walter's signature. It felt as though a voice from the past had suddenly entered the room. My husband had always been a careful planner. He believed that protecting family was not something you did when trouble arrived. It was something you prepared for long before anyone saw trouble coming. I slowly turned the pages Michael had placed in front of me. Every document carried dates stretching back years. Some were signed shortly before Walter's passing. Others had been updated quietly afterward according to instructions he had left behind. The trust itself was substantial, far larger than I expected. It included investment accounts, property interests, and assets that had grown steadily over time. My hands became cold as I realized the full picture. Walter had not simply left something for Mason. He had created a future for him. Why did Walter keep this secret? I asked. Michael leaned back in his chair. Because he wanted Mason protected from outside influence until he reached adulthood. I nodded slowly. That sounded exactly like Walter. He trusted people, but he never ignored human nature. Money could change how people behaved. It could expose sides of them that remained hidden for years. Michael opened another folder and slid several copies of emails across the table. These are the questions Rachel submitted over the past 6 months. I read them carefully. At first glance they seemed innocent. Requests for clarification. Questions about trust administration. Inquiries about beneficiary conditions. But the more I read, the more uneasy I became. Every question centered on the same issue. Mason. Not Daniel. Not the family. Mason. She was looking for something, I said quietly. Yes, Michael replied. And she became increasingly persistent. I continued reading. One message asked whether a beneficiary could lose eligibility under certain circumstances. Another asked who would control distributions if a child no longer lived in a specific household. A third requested information about guardianship provisions. My stomach tightened. Individually, each question appeared harmless. Together, they formed a pattern. Rachel had been studying the trust, looking for weaknesses, looking for opportunities, looking for ways to gain influence over something that did not belong to her. Did you answer all of these? I asked. Only within legal limits, Michael said. Most requests were denied. I set the papers down. Suddenly memories began resurfacing. Small moments I had ignored at the time. Rachel discouraging Mason from attending family gatherings. Rachel insisting that certain financial topics remain private. Rachel becoming strangely irritated whenever Walter's name came up in conversation. None of it seemed important then. Now every memory felt different. Like pieces of a puzzle slowly fitting together. Michael checked his watch. There is one more thing you should know. He opened a final folder and removed a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. My breath caught when I recognized the handwriting. Walter's handwriting. Across the front were 5 simple words. To be opened if necessary. I stared at the envelope without touching it. After all these years, my husband was still reaching across time, still trying to protect someone he loved. And for the first time since Mason arrived at my house, I felt certain of one thing. Whatever Rachel believed she was doing, Walter had anticipated far more than any of us realized. My fingers trembled slightly as I picked up the envelope. For a moment I simply looked at it. Walter had been gone for 12 years, yet somehow his presence still filled the room. Michael remained silent, allowing me the space to decide when I was ready. Finally, I broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. The paper was worn but carefully preserved. I immediately recognized Walter's neat handwriting. Dear Evelyn, if you are reading this, circumstances have forced certain truths into the open earlier than I hoped. My eyes moved slowly across the page. Every word felt deliberate. Every sentence sounded exactly like the man I had loved for more than 40 years. Walter explained that he had created the trust after noticing how quickly family dynamics could change when money entered the picture. He wanted one member of the family protected above all others. Mason. Not because he was favored, but because Walter believed he would someday need protection from decisions made by adults around him. I stopped reading and looked at Michael. How could he have known? Michael gave a small shrug. Walter was observant. More observant than most people realized. I returned to the letter. The next section made my heart pound. Walter described a series of safeguards built into the trust. No parent, guardian, spouse, or extended family member could access the assets for personal benefit. Every distribution would be independently reviewed. Any attempt to manipulate custody, residence, guardianship, or family relationships for financial gain would trigger an immediate legal review. I lowered the page. Suddenly Rachel's questions made perfect sense. She had been searching for a way around the protections. She had not found one. There is more, Michael said quietly. I continued reading. Near the end of the letter, Walter wrote something that sent a chill through me. If anyone attempts to isolate Mason from family members who act in his best interest, consider that a warning sign. Such actions rarely happen without motive. The room became very still. I thought about Mason sitting alone at my kitchen table. I thought about the confusion in his eyes. I thought about Rachel telling him he no longer belonged. Walter had written those words over a decade ago, yet somehow he had described exactly what was happening now. Did Rachel ever learn the value of the trust? I asked. Michael nodded slowly. Not the exact amount, but she learned enough to know it was significant. And Daniel? Daniel knows almost nothing. That answer did not surprise me. My son had always trusted people he loved, sometimes too much. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope. Then I noticed one final document resting beneath it. Michael slid it toward me. This arrived 3 weeks ago. It was a formal request submitted by Rachel's attorney. The request sought information about future trust administration in the event of changes to Mason's living arrangements. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. Suddenly the timeline became impossible to ignore. Rachel began asking questions 6 months ago. The legal request arrived 3 weeks ago. Mason was removed from the house yesterday. None of it was accidental. None of it was emotional. It was a plan. A carefully constructed plan that had been unfolding for months. As I stared at the document, my phone vibrated. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. Before I could speak, his voice came through strained and uneasy. "Mom," he said, "I just got home. Rachel is gone. And there is something in my office that I think you need to see." The drive to Daniel's house felt longer than usual. Gray clouds still hung low over the town, and the streets glistened from the previous night's rain. Michael followed in his own car. Neither of us spoke much during the trip. My thoughts kept returning to the documents, the trust, and Walter's warning. By the time we arrived, Daniel was already waiting in the driveway. The moment I stepped out of the car, I saw it in his face. Something had changed. He looked exhausted. Not physically exhausted. Emotionally exhausted. Like a man who had spent hours staring at pieces of a puzzle he never wanted to solve. He let us inside without saying much. The house felt strangely empty. Rachel's coat was gone from the hallway closet. Her car was not in the driveway. Even the family photographs on the living room shelves seemed different somehow. Daniel guided us to his home office and closed the door behind us. A cardboard storage box sat on the desk. "I found this hidden in the guest room closet," he said quietly. "I was looking for some paperwork Rachel mentioned last week." My stomach tightened. Daniel opened the box. Inside were folders, printed emails, handwritten notes, and financial records. Michael immediately moved closer. We spent nearly an hour examining the contents. The deeper we looked, the worse it became. Rachel had been gathering information for months. notes about the trust, copies of legal articles, lists of questions regarding guardianship and beneficiary rights. There was even a calendar tracking conversation she had held with attorneys and financial consultants. Daniel stood silently beside the desk while Michael reviewed each document. Several times my son rubbed his forehead as though trying to wake himself from a bad dream. Finally he spoke. "I never saw any of this." No one answered. Because we believed him. The confusion in his voice was genuine. He looked less like a participant and more like another victim of the deception unfolding around him. Then Michael pulled a single sheet from the bottom of the box. The room became very quiet. It was a draft proposal, not an official filing. Not yet, but the intent was unmistakable. The document outlined possible future custody arrangements if Mason's living situation changed. My breath caught. Rachel had not simply been researching financial matters. She had been preparing scenarios, planning ahead, building options. Daniel sank into his chair and stared at the page. "This cannot be real," he whispered. Michael remained calm. "It is real." My son looked up. His eyes were filled with disbelief. Why would she do this? I thought about Walter's letter, about the trust, about the months of questions, about a frightened 10-year-old sitting at my kitchen table wondering what he had done wrong. "Because she wanted control," I said softly. No one argued. For several moments the only sound came from the ticking clock on the office wall. Then Daniel reached into the box one final time. His hand emerged holding a sealed envelope. Unlike the others, this one had been addressed directly to him. The handwriting was Rachel's. His face grew pale as he stared at it. Slowly, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter. He read the first few lines in silence. Then his expression changed completely. "Oh my God," he whispered. "She admits everything." Daniel's hand shook as he held the letter. I had not seen my son look that vulnerable since the day we buried his father. He stared at the page for several seconds before finally continuing to read. Michael and I remained silent. Whatever was written there had clearly shattered something inside him. When he finally lowered the paper, his eyes were filled with a mixture of shock, disappointment, and regret. "She knew about the trust months ago," he said quietly. "She admits it." The room seemed to grow heavier. Daniel swallowed hard and continued reading portions aloud. Rachel wrote that she had become frustrated after learning how carefully the trust was protected. She described feeling excluded from decisions involving assets that could one day affect the family's future. She claimed she was only trying to secure opportunities for everyone. But the further Daniel read, the less convincing those explanations became. Several passages revealed something far more troubling. Rachel had intentionally concealed information. She had consulted attorneys without telling Daniel. She had explored different legal pathways. Most disturbing of all, she admitted that distancing Mason from certain family members could make future legal arguments easier to manage. Daniel stopped reading. The silence that followed felt endless. I looked out the office window. Afternoon sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. Cars moved along the street below. Ordinary people were living ordinary lives while our family stood in the middle of a storm none of us had expected. "I do not understand," Daniel whispered. "We had everything we needed." Michael folded his hands. "This was never about need." Daniel looked up. Michael's expression remained calm. Sometimes people begin chasing control. Once that happens, they stop seeing where the line is. My son lowered his eyes. For the first time, he seemed willing to confront what had been happening around him. Not just during the last few days, but for months, maybe even years. Small moments, missed warnings, conversations he never questioned. Looking back, he could finally see the pattern. Then his phone rang. Rachel. Her name appeared on the screen. The three of us stared at it. Daniel hesitated before answering. "Hello." His voice was steady. We could not hear her side of the conversation, but we watched his expression carefully. At first he listened quietly. Then his jaw tightened. Finally he said something that surprised me. "Mason is staying with my mother." A pause. "No. That is not changing." Another pause. Daniel's face hardened further. "We will discuss everything later. But right now my priority is my son." He ended the call and slowly set the phone down. For the first time since this ordeal began, I saw a glimpse of the man Walter had always believed Daniel could become. Not a frightened husband trying to avoid conflict. Not a confused father caught in the middle. A father making a choice. Michael stood and gathered several documents. "We need to move carefully," he said. "But we also need to move quickly." Daniel nodded. "What happens next?" Michael looked directly at both of us. "Next, we bring every fact into the open. No assumptions. No secrets. No private explanations. Everyone sits at the same table." I thought about Walter's letter resting safely in my purse. I thought about Mason waiting at my house. And for the first time I felt something other than worry. I felt certainty. The truth had spent months hiding in the shadows. Now it was finally stepping into the light. 2 days later, everyone gathered in Michael Reed's conference room. The atmosphere felt nothing like a family meeting. It felt like a final reckoning. The long oak table divided the room into 2 sides. Daniel sat beside me. Michael occupied the seat at the head of the table. Rachel arrived 10 minutes late. She walked in with confident steps and a carefully controlled expression. But I noticed something immediately. She was studying the room, measuring it, trying to determine how much we knew. When her eyes landed on the folders stacked in front of Michael, a flicker of concern crossed her face before disappearing. She took her seat without greeting anyone. For several moments no one spoke. Then Michael opened the meeting. His voice remained calm and professional. He reviewed the trust documents first. Every provision, every safeguard, every instruction Walter had left behind. Rachel listened quietly. Occasionally she crossed her arms. Occasionally she glanced toward Daniel. But she never interrupted. Then Michael presented the timeline. 6 months of inquiries, legal consultations, written requests, emails, calendar records. One document after another appeared on the large screen mounted to the wall. The room grew quieter with every page. Daniel stared straight ahead. I could see the disappointment settling deeper into his expression. Rachel's confidence slowly began to fade. Finally, Michael displayed the draft proposal recovered from the storage box. The same proposal outlining potential future arrangements involving Mason. Rachel immediately leaned forward. "That document was never filed," she said. It was the first time she had spoken. Michael nodded. "Correct. It was not filed." He paused. "But it was prepared." Rachel looked away. Michael continued. He presented the letter Rachel had written to Daniel. Several passages were read aloud. Not accusations. Not assumptions. Her own words. The room became painfully still. Every explanation she had offered over the previous months suddenly collapsed under the weight of the evidence. Daniel finally turned toward her. "Why did you never tell me?" His voice was not angry. Somehow that made it worse. Rachel opened her mouth but struggled to answer. "I was trying to protect our future," she said at last. Daniel shook his head slowly. "By pushing my son away?" No response came. The silence stretched across the room. Then Michael reached for one final folder. The oldest folder. Walter's folder. He carefully removed the letter I had read days earlier. The room listened as Walter's words were read aloud. His warnings. His hopes. His reasons for creating the trust. Most importantly, his belief that family should never be treated as an obstacle to financial gain. When the reading ended, nobody spoke for several seconds. Rachel's eyes remained fixed on the table. Daniel looked exhausted. I found myself staring at the empty chair beside the wall and imagining Walter sitting there, watching everything unfold exactly as he had predicted. Then Michael closed the folder and folded his hands. "The facts are now fully documented," he said quietly. "The truth is no longer hidden." For the first time since this nightmare began, there was nothing left to uncover. Only decisions remained. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Not easier, but quieter. Sometimes the loudest storms leave behind the deepest silence. Daniel focused entirely on rebuilding his relationship with Mason. He moved slowly, carefully, understanding that trust is not restored with a single apology. It is rebuilt through consistent actions. Day after day, choice after choice, Mason continued staying at my house during that period. The first few days he remained cautious, reserved, as though he was waiting for another door to close unexpectedly. But children have remarkable resilience when they are surrounded by people who truly care for them. Gradually the laughter returned. The uncertainty faded. The light came back into his eyes. One Saturday morning, a month after everything came to light, Mason and I sat on the back porch watching the sunrise. Autumn had painted the trees in shades of gold and amber. A gentle breeze moved through the yard. He held a mug of hot chocolate while I wrapped myself in an old blanket Walter used to love. "Great-grandma?" he asked. "Yes, sweetheart. Did Grandpa Walter really write that letter for me?" I smiled. "He did." Mason stared out toward the trees. "Why?" The question lingered between us. I thought carefully before answering. "Because he loved you. And because he wanted to make sure you always had people protecting you." Mason nodded thoughtfully. Children understand more than adults often realize. A few days later, Michael arranged for one final meeting. Not in a conference room. Not around legal documents. At my house. Daniel came. Mason came. Michael came. We sat around the same dining room table where my family had celebrated birthdays, holidays, and countless ordinary evenings over the years. Michael brought one final item from Walter's estate. A sealed envelope that had remained untouched all this time. The letter inside was addressed directly to Mason. Since Mason was still young, Daniel read it aloud. Walter's words filled the room. He wrote about kindness, integrity, responsibility. He explained that true wealth was never measured by numbers on paper. It was measured by character, by the way a person treated others when no one was watching. Near the end, Walter wrote something that brought tears to my eyes. "If you are reading this, Mason, remember that being loved is not something you earn. It is something you deserve simply because you are family." The room fell silent. Daniel stopped reading and lowered the letter. Mason sat very still. Then he quietly stood up, walked around the table, and wrapped his arms around his father. Neither of them said a word. They did not need to. Some moments speak for themselves. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in the living room and looked at Walter's photograph on the mantel. The same photograph I had passed 100 times before. For the first time in months I felt at peace. Not because everything had been perfect. Not because the pain had disappeared. But because the truth had won. A frightened child had learned he was valued. Father had remembered his responsibilities. And a promise made years ago by a loving grandfather had done exactly what it was intended to do. It had protected the future. Family can survive many things. Mistakes. Misunderstandings. Even betrayal. But only when people choose honesty over control and love over self-interest. Looking back now, that was the lesson Walter left behind for all of us. And it was worth far more than anything written inside a trust.